This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the newest edition in the Compliance Podcast Network, my latest podcast, Compliance and Coronavirus. As the voice of compliance, I wanted to start a podcast which will help bring both clarity and sanity to the field of compliance, the compliance practitioner, and indeed the compliance profession during this worldwide health and healthcare crisis. Taking up a variety of topics as diverse as working from home, to sporting events, to the role of the board of directors, to crisis management, to the role of supply chains. We will look at all of these in this podcast. If you have a topic you'd like covered on compliance and coronavirus, please let me know. I'd be happy to do a podcast on it. We continue Exiger Week on compliance and coronavirus with Brandon Daniels, President of Global Markets at Exiger. He takes a look at security, supply chain, and the management of data, not only in the era of COVID-19, but as we move forward into the second half of the year and into 2021. I know you will enjoy it. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And today, I'm extraordinarily thrilled to have with me Brandon Daniels, President of Global Markets at Exiger. Brandon, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be back.
So, Brandon, I've wanted to visit with you about some of the things that you and your team at Exiger are seeing at this point around coronavirus health crisis, COVID-19, but also what you may see. I used to ask people in Q3 and Q4, but I think I need to now ask what you might see down the road in 2021 and beyond. So with that, what are two or three of the top questions you guys are getting from your clients about where we might be now, particularly around compliance?
Yeah, so one critical area that we are receiving questions about is the area of compliance reporting. So everyone is under substantial constraint at this moment in time. First of all, there's not a free flow of data. Second of all, there are fewer resources with which you have to conduct business. And third, the complexity of executing some of the compliance audit functions that you would typically conduct in person is increasingly stressing or is under increased stress when we are remote. So those same functions that we used to do in person, that we used to sort of have at the ready, now are under significant constraint. And so one of the things that people are asking us about is, how do we interact with our regulators and discuss openly and effectively how we can mitigate these constraints, how we can still comply with reporting requirements, how we can still assess suspicious activity and report that on a routine basis, whilst not hurting our data privacy policies or data privacy standards in terms of taking data out of the bank or out of the corporation, right? And so what we're seeing is that many clients are trying to establish and trying to create a more collaborative interface with their regulators in order to meet regulatory demands, whilst also understanding that they are under substantial constraints. The second thing that has come up quite a bit in this COVID crisis is, how do you still execute those projects that you've been mandated to execute? We've seen regulatory enforcement start to kick up around the globe again. We've seen the Monetary Authority of Singapore take some severe actions against companies, for instance, in the recent months. And I think globally we're going to start to see a resumption of global compliance enforcement. Now, what does that mean? It means that you have to thread the needle of executing major projects that used to be done on site, off site, right? Those could be major remediation projects. Those could be major technology rollouts. Those could be ramp-ups of your compliance staff that have come off the back of an investigation and a Department of Justice inquiry, right? And now what you have to do is to walk a line between policy and requirement. And people almost have to rewrite policy in order to meet requirements. And so what we're getting from people are questions about how to be creative, right? How do you still assess files that you have from your compliance department when you don't have the authority to transfer that information to remote professionals outside of your corporation, right? How do you still manage that review? Can you do review or compliance checks with anonymized data is one of the questions we're getting a lot because people want to adhere to data privacy standards, but still execute these big remediation projects. And then the third question I'm getting a lot is related to actually, and this is something that we've seen from some of the biggest corporations in the world, is how to start to incorporate supply chain risk management in what they've been doing with third-party risk management. And that's one of the most interesting questions I've heard because, in almost every single briefing from the president, in much of the much of the reporting you've seen around COVID, you've seen supply chain risk management come up as a hot topic. Well, people in the corporate sphere were largely managing third parties from a risk and compliance perspective on the anti-bribery, anti-corruption side, or they were managing them on just cyber, and then finally, price and performance. Now, in terms of supply chain risk management, they have to think from in a really critical way about how that supply could be subject to sabotage, how that supply could be subject to problematic capital, especially as it starts to enter some of the major critical infrastructure sectors like the medical sector or the bulk power system or the energy sector, right? You have to start thinking about how your supply of critical componentry could be subject to sabotage. That's a completely new world. And so those are the three major things that I'm hearing. How do I report? How do I collaborate with my regulator? How do I still execute these large projects off-site and in a remote manner? Can we get creative about how we manage data? And then three, I'm hearing a lot about supply chain risk management enter into the compliance conversation.
Brandon, if I could turn to maybe 6, 12, 18 months out, what I guess one of my observations has been that ideas, issues, and topics that may have arisen in 2018 or 2019 and were going through a normal life cycle of ideas have sped up exponentially. And we are at true inflection points on many different things. Data comes to mind immediately, but and there really is a new normal, and it's here and it's coming. And so I was wondering, what do you see in maybe that time frame that companies are really going to need to consider that they were told they should have considered over the past 18 months or so, but now they have to? So what do you see really on that realm?
One of the things that was done in, for instance, Graham Leach Bliley is to establish standards through which you could manage data in a outsourced model while still adhering to the standards that were required in order to protect that data. And what we're going to have to do in order to meet the needs of 12 to 18 months from now is rethink and get really smart on how data security actually works, right? I think people don't have a good concept of what data residency is, what VPNs are, and whether or not that actually serves as data transfer, and how to create policies that effectively protect data no matter where someone is, right? And then to get comfortable with the fact that those protections are real. And so I think that there is going to have to be a real analysis of what are the required protections, what are the standards that are going to be necessary in order to allow much broader remote work capabilities. I think today many people think of the premises as the walls around which your data and your information is contained. I think people are starting to recognize that the premises is an abstract concept when we're talking about the cloud, or we're talking about data and machines, or we're talking about networking. Your premises, your physical premises, only in the context of having literally a storage drive that's offline, the premises is it's ethereal. It's not real, right? And so what we need to do is determine how to regulate a virtual premises, how to make it so that people can work across multiple jurisdictions, multiple states, right? You've seen the California Data Privacy Protection Act come out, right, and come into force. How do you work across states and adhere to those standards if you're a California-based company or dealing with data that contains residents from California? How do you work in the UK, the United States, and EU and keep everything aligned to a GDPR-focused model, right? A GDPR adherent model. And I think we're going to have to go extraterritorial, not in a bad way, but in a good way, and say there is a reduction of GDPR that is the EU cyber standard, for instance. And you can apply that at a machine level no matter where somebody is in the world. Right? You can make it so that they can only view the data, they can only manipulate the data remotely, but everything is stored in the country of residency. And that does not constitute a data transfer, right? Because you're just not going to have the ability to travel over to the EU or have people from the EU travel over to the United States with that kind of fluency, and we're going to lose specialization. We're going to lose the ability to get the best person for the best work. And that's detrimental to our economy. That's detrimental to our businesses. So I think we're going to have to get smarter on data privacy standards, and we're going to have to start to make them operationally effective no matter where the computer sits in the world, and make it so that you can have virtual private sessions that adhere to different country models, and that the EU regulators, the UK regulators, the US regulators, the Singapore regulators say, yup, you meet our standards, and so therefore you can view and look at data from, I don't know, Vietnam, right? So that's one. The second thing is...
Before you get to number two, could I maybe follow up, instead of data privacy, data protection? And several years ago, I interviewed the CISO of Coca-Cola, and he told me that he basically used a risk-based approach, looking at the data, which was the highest risk to the company. And he said it plainly. You know what the highest risk data to Coke is. I know what it is. Every bad guy in the world knows what it is. That is the one thing I cannot let be breached. And so I have the strongest data protection around that. And that to me was a simple risk-based analysis based upon the value of the data. Does that concept still hold? Or with this change that you just talked about in terms of data privacy, does that also change the calculation for data protection for the top data? Do you now need to have a much more layered or nuanced approach?
What you just mentioned, I call the crown jewels approach, and I think it's smart. I think it's practical, And I don't think with the model that I'm mentioning that changes, right? If you have a data set which is the proprietary information that is the engine or the fuel to your organization, that should be maintained in a exceptional place of cybersecurity, right? That doesn't necessarily change the idea that you would nuance the privacy or protection controls across jurisdictions. But for the real crown jewels, you may actually never put it on the internet, right? You may have physical controls around it that are above and beyond not putting it or making it available to any outside network sources, right? So there is always that risk-based approach. You can't slice it too thinly, otherwise your cyber model becomes so complex that the cost of your organization would be twice of what it is today. But you can say, hey, here's tier 1 data, and tier 1 data sits offline. It sits only available to certain people, and there are physical access controls around it that are similar to a SCIF in the federal government, right? It's top secret. And then there's this whole segment of information that we need to understand where it's being accessed, why it's being accessed, and how it's being accessed. And that is subject to enhanced cyber controls and individual, literally down to the person permissioning. You only get permission to it to the extent that you absolutely need to do. And it has to go through, a human process in order to be validated. And then you've got a segment of data below that just needs to be subject to different privacy standards or different communication channels or different platforms. So I do believe in a risk-based approach. I think there is a crown jewel in every organization that should be held and guarded. But I think below that, a sensible risk-based approach is important.
Okay, back to number 2.
Yeah. So the second thing I see is that COVID has set off, and this goes to my third point on what we're hearing from corporates and seeing them ramp up around in terms of compliance and risk. I'm seeing the different security measures that global powers are taking, starting to infiltrate the compliance minds and security minds of CCOs and CISOs, right? Chief Compliance Officers and Chief Information Security Officers. And that's because you're seeing things like the UK ban of Huawei in the 5G infrastructure. You're seeing EO 13920, which is starting to regulate the ability for adversarial capital, adversarial powers that could potentially sabotage our energy sector being used in the bulk power system. You're seeing things like Section 889, which are starting to roll out and create additional cyber requirements and componentry and supply chain requirements inside of the defense industrial base, which isn't a small group of companies. Again, it's estimated that anywhere between 160,000 and 300,000 companies are in the defense industrial base. If you think about that from a United States economy perspective, that's a huge volume of our GDP. And then you are also seeing things like the reform to medical device supply chains and pharmaceutical supply chains, starting to create additional requirements for compliance officers and CISOs that they weren't thinking about yesterday. For instance, the foreign ownership, control, and influence analysis that they now have to start doing on their underlying supply, FOCI for short, is going to increase the burden substantially that they're going to be under to comply with United States government regulations. And I mean, with the pronouncement in the UK of the Huawei ban in 5G, you're also going to see, right, increased controls in the UK as well from a supply chain perspective. So you zoom out on what that does inside of the corporate market, and it creates an incentive model to execute a lot of your work, to build supply chains in either the United States or in ally partner jurisdictions, or it creates an incentive to build out much tougher cyber standards and much tougher compliance standards that you can monitor and measure on an ongoing basis, so that when you're subject to scrutiny, you can survive that scrutiny. And that's a major overhaul that the corporate market is going to see in the next 18, 24 months, and will be, from my perspective, one of the most impactful ways in which the compliance officers are going to have to start driving the way that their companies do business. And also, it's going to be a huge opportunity from an economic growth perspective for a lot of CISOs and CCOs to show that they've got controls. They can get a much larger share of work because they, as a downstream provider to some of the big companies on the bulk power supply, would be very attractive.
Brandon, it strikes me in listening to that, particularly around the corporate sector, if we look at critical or high security corporate functions in America, obviously healthcare, pharmaceutical, energy production, both in bulk energy creation, but also in oil and gas development, construction, manufacturing, really almost any industry that is not a consumer product could be deemed to be in the national interests of the United States and subject to this type of scrutiny that you just described. Could we see it move literally into that level of corporate America?
Oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. You don't have to look far to get a sense of where Treasury has already gone to control or to protect American interests. You don't have to do a deep dive analysis to see what bellwethers are there. If you just look at, I'm sure you've had a chance to look at the parameters of the CFIUS pilot program, specifically the implementation of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, the FIRMA, where they have laid out initial NAICS codes against which they want to start reviewing all foreign transactions, right? They want to apply additional scrutiny at that Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. And they include things like aircraft manufacturing, right? That's NAICS code 336411. They include aluminum refining. They include nuclear electric power generation. They include primary battery manufacturing. They include telephone apparatus manufacturing. So when you think about the span of companies that could be subject to this supply chain risk management area as an enhancement to what we're doing around third-party risk management, you could conceivably see almost every industry being impacted that's, as you mentioned, not a fast-moving consumable good, right? And that is going to create a completely different lens, a completely different spend category in the area of compliance. And again, it's either going to drive an incentive for much stronger U.S.-based supply chains or ally supply chains, or it's going to create much stronger compliance controls when you've got outsourced operations.
So, Brandon, do you have a number 3?
So in terms of a number 3 for COVID, I see that leaders are leaders of businesses, leaders of compliance organizations, leaders across the board are starting to think about the way in which they manage differently. I think people are moving to technology-based interactions in a much more robust way. And it is creating a level of intimacy in working relationships that wasn't there before. I mean, right now, you and I are speaking, you're coming into my home, right? You're hearing the vacuum, you're hearing my kids, you're hearing, my family, you're hearing my dogs, right? That level of interaction, that level of private and public facing personas getting integrated, right, is increasing the requirement for leadership to inherently think holistically about their employees. And so I think what you're going to see over the next 18 to 24 months, and something that's going to be embedded in our culture from here on out, is a much more evolved sense of the person when it comes to our employees, right? I think that's important for cyber standards. I think that's important for workplace management. I think that's important for, much more robust remote work, is that you have to get to know people in a deeper way, because if you're not face-to-face every day, if you don't see the body language every day, if you can't stop in the office, then leaders have to become much more engaged, and they have to understand their people at a deeper level to create that same connection that is almost taken for granted when you're working in person.
Well, Brandon, this has been a great conversation, but unfortunately we are near the end of our time. But I hope as we move forward into the second half of this year and perhaps even 2021, I might be able to ask you to come back and visit with some of these topics again.
Of course. Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance and Coronavirus. This is the only B2B podcast which brings clear and sane information for both the compliance professional and the business executive. If I could ask you to do one thing, if you could tell one person about this podcast, I'm trying to get the word out about this most unique podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network. So if you could tell one person about it, send them a copy, send them a link, do something to help me publicize this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. Compliance and Coronavirus is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network, and it appears Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of each week. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode.